Howdy, folks. Happy Monday. It's early. We're earlier here, because I have a medical procedure that I must go through this afternoon, which I'm so looking forward to. But we are here. We are actually here. July 13th, the opening of Phase 3. I didn't think it would ever get here. We'll see if it actually comes to fruition in terms of we are all keeping our fingers crossed that we get to August 1st, that we get to games, because I think it's going to be really exciting if we do that. But we have a lot of things to, get past before that happens. But let's start with the pre-show. Go ahead, Russ.
Well, just as you're not very excited for this afternoon, Daniel Snyder was not very excited about finally changing the team name of the Washington Redskins, which now they've gone the route of the Seattle Hockey Club, and we don't know what their name is. They're just Washington. And so they have to know soon, though, because they have to make uniforms and they have to print media and they have to do advertising. And so they're going to have to figure out that name within the next week. But it's good news that they finally have gotten rid of this name. Only because Snyder, literally, the only good argument he had for keeping it was he wanted to make more money off of it. That was it.
I heard that they may for this season because from what I heard, a lot of the advertising things like for DirecTV and other things have already gone out. So they're not going to have the additional cost of resending out everything. So they may be the Washington Football Club just for this year, and may wear the generic. Remember there was like an R.
Yep. The 1970s they used to wear it.
Right. So they may wear that and just call them the Washington Football Club and then have a big release next year. Maybe that's not a bad idea, but I really think that the NFL doesn't want to incur the additional cost of having to rebrand everything and redo everything at the 11th hour.
No, that's probably true.
Well, I mean, he's got no memorabilia to sell right now. If you think about it, right, the merchandise, Nike's already said they're going to pull everything from the stores, which they did, right? FedEx was going to pull the naming, right? So this was clearly, as we discussed previously, a dollars and cents thing for Snyder, and his co-owners or his minority owners were very adamant, where a lot of them wanted to pull out because of the fact that to say that he was less than happy about doing this is putting it very mildly.
Well,
and the coach and Ron Rivera was all for pulling this name out. He's a first-year coach for them and didn't like it. At the end of the day, I get the arguments for both sides because there's always going to be people that say, I don't like that it's changed. I don't think it should be changed. Whatever. It's going to be changed. And it's a historic day because in the end, this doesn't happen very often.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. What they're creating here is an incredible black market because you're more than likely you're going to have Redskins throwback jerseys made by places in China and Vietnam for people who don't believe that it should be changed. And I think that if they come up with a good name and then it won't be that big of a deal. But somebody in the chat saying the favorite is Red Tails. I think that's
Warriors has been favored. I mean, it's
Warriors.
We talk a lot about this, right? So the Braves have officially pretty much come out and said they're not changing the name, but they will revisit the use of the tomahawk chop, which is something we discussed last week.
What's there to revisit? Stop doing it. It's
but the problem is, Russ, is that the fans will
do it. So
without the da 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 da.
But they don't have to play the music,
right?
No, but they will continue to do it.
And
maybe.
And the Chiefs also have said they're not going to change their name as well. So I mean, look, part of this depends on your view as to the derivation of the name and what it's used for. And I don't think the Redskins necessarily have done a particularly good job of dealing with the Native American groups that have been less than happy about having that name, right? There's other, I'm sure, organizations that have had much more intense and detailed conversations with them in terms of the use of that name. But Redskins has clearly been viewed as a derogatory name for many years. It's not the first time that it's come up where the name should be changed. I mean, we talk about, just in DC, right? You have the Bullets, right? Did Bullets change their name because Poland didn't think it was sending the right message? I'm not sure if Wizards is necessarily any better.
But you want to know something? There is no black market for that. I don't see people walking around with Bullets stuff on.
Nope. Very rare. I mean, you will see people maybe if guys have throwback Elvin Hayes and Wes Unseld and other type of jerseys, but other than that, not really.
On this one, are we going to see people are going to pull out Kirk Cousins jerseys just in defiance? I mean, are they going to wear Tim Smith? I mean, it's like if you wear that, that's on you, man.
Theismann,
Kilmer.
John Riggins.
You've got to find one for Kilmer, and I'm sure Mitchell Ness is going to stop making them.
Probably.
So
I'm sure there's a lot of Riggins ones that are out there, though.
Yeah, there's probably a few Riggins. That's fair. But again, Mitchell and Ness is the other link in this, and they'll probably stop making them.
Do you think? Because
I do.
I just think from a perception perspective, you don't want to necessarily feed into the fact that you're going against. And plus, don't forget, if it's pulled by the NFL, I don't think they want to have the conversation with the NFL, because the NFL, I'm sure, is going to crack down on a group that has a definitive link. Now, you talked about the ones made in China. They really can't do much about that. But the ones that are made here with Mitchell and Ness having a contract probably with the NFL, those are the ones that can prevent them from making it. You need to pull that from the inventory. Yeah,
the only thing that the NFL can prevent is people going on to their website and making Ron Mexico jerseys when it was Michael Vick. I mean, they could prevent that, but they couldn't prevent other things. So we saw this morning the notification of the passing of actress Kelly Preston, who is as famous for being married to John Travolta as she is for her career. It's weird because she wasn't an Academy Award winning actress or anything like that, but she was a very, very beautiful girl, and it's disgusting. 57 years old, and she dies of breast cancer. But it's like, for guys of our age, the fact that she was sort of that coming of age, this beautiful actress who was in a bunch of movies. I forgot Secret Admirer, but that's that's the one that. But there was a movie that HBO played over and over and over called Mischief. It was just a bad movie with
Doug
McKean and Catherine Mary Stewart, and she was like the thing to watch because she was so beautiful. But it's really sad. 57 years old and she's gone. And
the same thing with The Experts when it came out. That was another one, which I think
The Experts,
with R.A. Gross in it, and that was the one. She played a very similar role, but from a sports perspective, clearly she's most well known for Love of the Game, right? And
Jerry Maguire.
And Jerry Maguire. Yeah. Yep, no question. She was clearly, the love interest for Love of the Game for Kevin Costner. And the fact, first of all, rest in peace, Travolta family, regardless what you think about John Travolta, losing a son at 16 and now losing his wife at 57. And clearly the interesting part is, this was kept very quiet by the family. I mean, nobody knew about this until, unfortunately, the announcement came out this morning. And for somebody at 57 to pass away is just way too young, unfortunately.
Yeah. Just one more thing before we start, because it's sort of in line with what some of the things we're going to talk about. It's interesting how different sports are treating the positives. We found out from a couple of the Yankee reporters that Aroldis Chapman, the closer for the Yankees, tested positive for COVID. And they said, well, he had mild symptoms and, he's okay, but he's going to be separate from the club for a couple weeks and things of that nature. And, we're going to get into what the NHL talked about in terms of revealing injuries and revealing positives. But, Russ, it's the complete 180-degree opposite when it comes to baseball.
But is it the team that's telling us, or is it the player that has just put it out there? It seems like it's the player.
The way it works in baseball is that the team can reveal it if the player acquiesces to him revealing.
So the player has to approve it.
The player has to be part of HIPAA law, right? That the player has to agree to do that, right? But in hockey, it's right. Even if the player is agreeing to it, and again, it'd be interesting to see if a player reveals his own diagnosis, what the league will end up doing. But the league
I don't think they'll do anything.
Really adamant that they are not going to tell when players have positive diagnoses, even if the player is acquiescing to it.
They're not going to tell, but the player could tell.
I'm assuming that. I'm not sure. Can the NHL crack down on a player for revealing his own diagnosis? Probably not. No.
And Russ, I know that you wrote your book, Pioneers of Baseball, and part of it was having to do with a major league team back in the day in Buffalo. Well, we may have a major league team in Buffalo this year based on the current border strife going on with Canada, because it sounds like the Canadian government gave a waiver to the Blue Jays for them being able to hold their spring training games. But when it comes to other teams coming in, and when it comes to them after coming back from the U.S., there's still something up in the air regarding the quarantine situation. And like to the point that if a player gets caught out, there's like a $750,000 fine and possible jail time and some stuff like that. So there's been talk over this weekend of the Blue Jays, and I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, of them playing in Buffalo, playing at Salem Field, which was originally built as a potential major league stadium, but they never put the upper deck on there.
Right.
Mike Harrington from the Buffalo News and a few other reports have indicated that there is a possibility, it is an option, and a strong option, that the Blue Jays could play in Buffalo the entire year.
Hey, I think it would be great. I mean, it would obviously get some jobs back for some people that probably thought they lost jobs this year when the minor leagues were essentially canceled. So to me, this is great. I mean, I know that place doesn't fill up and you can't have fans anyhow, but I think the town would be, there'd be a little bit of a buzz in the town that all of a sudden baseball is being played there and you get some coverage on TV. I think it's good for everybody. And like I said, I think there's jobs that would come back from that. And you know what? In a way, I'm kind of hoping that happens.
Well, it's
plus there's a bunch of guys that come up through that system, right? If you look at that team, right, you have a ton of Guerrero and Bichette and Biggio. All those guys recently played there, so they clearly have somewhat of a connection to Buffalo as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know that another pitcher basically said this isn't the Buffalo Blue Jays, it's the Toronto Blue Jays. So it's like, he was not exactly enthused. And apparently this guy, Thornton was the pitcher. He had stayed at the Skydome Hotel, the Rogers Hotel there all year last year. So he didn't think it was that much of a burden. But it has nothing to do with the burden. It has to do with the Canadian government allowing teams to come in and play. So, I mean, I know that there are issues about—
By the way, what burden would the Sky Hotel be? It's right there. You walk down the field
walk
right
the elevator
there.
to go downstairs. You're at the field. I mean, it's not like you're taking a long walk.
I know. I mean, I was eating breakfast there, and we were watching them vacuuming the field. Like, it's all that close. Like when I stayed over one time. So, yeah, I don't know what burden that would be.
Yeah, neither do I. But the only problems with the Buffalo Stadium supposedly would be lighting in terms of for major league quality, which I'm sure can be remedied with temporary lighting. There aren't going to be fans in the stands, so they could put lights in like where the stand or where the people would sit, so that they could do that. But I'll tell you one thing, I joked about this with some friends on social media. There will be a sizable amount of people. It'll be like the Cubs, like with the people standing on the roof at Cubs games. There will be a sizable amount of people standing out in like left center field where there's like a highway and there's like a little lawn area that will stand there to watch and try to catch like home runs from Guerrero Jr. or Aaron Judge or something like that when the Yankees are.
But what else can they do in this?
You can't do anything about that.
If people are dumb enough to congregate at like bars and things of that sort, then you're going to be dumb enough to do that, and if they contract COVID.
I was going to say, I mean, do you want to catch a COVID ball? I might have like gloves.
I will say this: this is one of the reasons why I think the whole hub city setup for the NHL is much more optimal than what Major League Baseball is doing here, because it does. I get why baseball is doing what it has to do in the circumstance, but I think for the possibility of a COVID outbreak in multiple cities, you're basically creating a congregation. We all saw it earlier in the thing when like PSG had their Champions League game outside the stadium. It was a ridiculous amount of people in the Paris streets outside that stadium. Want to be close to it. It's like bugs go. I hate to use the phrase. It's almost like bugs, glomming to the light. Ooh, we have to be close to it.
I mean, what's my choice? If I'm standing on the highway or watching it on television, I'm going to watch it on television.
Well, but this
you're also not a young person who thinks they're invincible too.
That's fair.
But this is the issue, and I know that, and I mentioned this before. I know that the big screen in Maple Leaf Square will not show. I would assume they're not going to show the games, because if they did show the games, people would congregate, especially for Leafs Blue Jackets. You will probably still have pockets of people in Toronto watching the games at sports bars. Probably.
Yeah, but when they get swept, it won't be that long. I mean,
jeez. Okay. Yes, the voice of reason, Russ Cohen. All right, let's start the show. Jan is okay. I'll do the thing for Jan. Hello, Hockey World. Today is Monday, July 13th, 2020. I'm Jan Levine.
I'm Anthony Mingione from Sunrise, Philly.
I'm Russ Cohen from Sportsology, playing myself.
And I'm Michael Lagello, and this is the Hockey Buzzcast here on HockeyBuzz.com. All right, let's start with what we discussed on the weekend. I already introduced you, Jan.
Hello.
I imitated you, Jan. Sorry.
I'm going to have to go back and watch this. I'm almost afraid.
Okay,
You may not want to.
Yeah.
Those good wishes on that medical procedure, Michael, I'm starting to rethink that a little bit.
Okay. Okay. So the Gary Bettman and Donald Fehr, along with Matthew Schneider and Bill Daly, had a conference call on Saturday regarding the finer points of the collective bargaining agreement, which was ratified by the players. I think it was
79%.
79%, yeah, and then quickly voted for by the Board of Governors. So we will have labor peace until 25-26, which I can't be understated. I mean, we've been through enough lockouts. We've been through a season that was missed, and I think, just as an overall view, both sides were in a situation where they had to compromise, but them having to compromise and actually doing it are two separate things. And I give a lot of credit to Gary Bettman and Donald Fehr for getting it done, Russ.
Well, just from a hockey.
So I don't know if you read Elliot Friedman's column on this. So Elliot Friedman, wrote a pretty good column on this in terms of knowing some of the machinations of the conversation. And the interesting part was, I watched most of the thing yesterday, just talking about how Fehr was remarking of, this is a different animal, right, than their usual negotiations. They had to consider a lot of other things and things that maybe they would have pushed for in the past, recognizing the status of what we're in now just as a country, and then in general within the sport, the need for labor peace kind of superseded everything. And there's a lot of pushback they got in terms of, how much money they should get. There was pushback in terms of the cap maybe being $65 million 1 year. So I give Fehr a lot of credit based upon his background of recognizing just what needed to be done, and that both sides kind of coming together. And yes, there are groups in both sides who are probably not going to be happy. I don't think there's things that we're happy about, but I think overall, collectively, we're in agreement that they ended up going in the right direction in terms of coming up with this agreement and for the length of time for what the agreement's going to stand for.
Actually, I don't know if you're going to find anybody that's going to say they're unhappy, even from the players' side. But in the industry, though, this is good because, this is an industry that writers are losing jobs and broadcast people are. And if we'd have gone into another year where it looked like there'd be a lockout, that would have gotten worse, too. So I think for some job security, this is actually good for a lot of people, too. So you could do a little planning because we all get into a state of flux. I remember one year I was doing cosmetics resets in supermarkets for the lockout to make up my lost revenue. So, that kind of stuff, definitely happens. As far as with Fehr, look, I honestly think he has gotten a bad rap for what happened in baseball. I don't think it's all Donald Fehr. I think if we look at it in hindsight, and I've talked about it, I've written about it, so I've studied him a bit. Outside of Donald Fehr, baseball still has the same problems. Yeah. So now it's unfair for us to kind of push it all on Donald Fehr and say, well, look, he's the guy who got all these lockouts.
I think you have to look at it in many ways with Fehr is that he's a lot like he can be a lot of cases like the commissioner of the players in that he has to abide by the will of the players and the people that he represents. And baseball players operate from, I think, a different mindset than hockey players do. And Fehr has pretty much indicated that in many ways in various times throughout his tenure about one of the reasons why he ended up taking over the reins for the PA. So, and it's been, I think, for the most part, a pretty good partnership, with the exception, obviously, of escrow and things of that sort. But again, you have to give to get certain things in this circumstance. So I think overall.
Go ahead. So the thing that is to me is that we talked about Fehr being the commissioner of the players, right? But we compare and contrast. We talked about Manfred and what's going on with baseball, right? He's under the behest of the owners, but he also can guide the owners and be the person who leads them in the right direction. And in this case, Fehr clearly ended up saying, look, this is the direction in which we need to go in. And he actually was able to get the players. Now, granted, hockey players, as you said, have a much different mentality than baseball players, partly because of just the nature of the sport itself. Partly, you look at what's happened with baseball pre-Marvin Miller and post-Marvin Miller. There's been a whole mind shift in terms of how they treat themselves and how they feel in terms of the game itself. But in this case, Fehr kind of put aside all that and said, look, this is what's going on in the country. This is what's going on in the sport. This is where we need to get to. let's find a common ground between the two sides as opposed to being divisive, because he could have easily gone that way, but he was able to get his constituency to be in line with what his mindset was also in terms of working with Bettman to try to come up with an agreement.
I mean, I covered the original Fear press conference when he was going into the league. It was live. It may have been, I don't know if it was at an all-star game, a draft. Maybe it was at the draft. And he had a press conference. And he did say he was pretty much done with what work he was doing. But the NHL players wanted him so badly and gave him such a story of being sort of like these down-to-earth guys that he felt like he could really help them. And that's why it's been really good, because he was probably fed up with baseball. Like, he probably was just like, you know what? After all that other stuff, the steroid scandal and everything else, he was probably burnt out and done.
Yeah,
and
you have to deal with again. It comes back to the mindset, some of the outsized egos in baseball versus hockey. And I don't want to pass too much of a but we know that we know the pecking, how people in the United States view the sport in terms of the pecking order traditionally, and that baseball players feel like, I think in a lot of circumstances, that they've got even more of a platform, but that doesn't take away from hockey players at all. We know the pecking order in terms of the priority.
Well, Jan referenced Marvin Miller. I mean, you have to accept the fact that the relationship between players and owners in baseball, going back to the Black Sox, and then like Kurt Flood, and then the Messerschmitt McNally decision, and the advent of free agency, it was inherently antagonistic. And that's whereas I think in the NHL, when Fear came in, I think the problem is that the Bob Goodenow era PA was incompetent, and if they would have had a competent leadership, you probably wouldn't have had a season that was completely missed. And that's what Fear brought in. Now, we missed half a season when he came in, but I think the road that the NHL went down with that CBA and now with this one, I think is beneficial to both. And if you look at where hockey is compared to baseball, football, and basketball, they're in a much better position now with labor peace and with both sides having something to lose than the NBA, where the players are complaining about accommodations in Orlando.
Well, yeah, I mean, Fear wasn't even a hockey guy, and they brought him into the culture. Same way Bettman, he wasn't a hockey guy either, but they brought him into the culture. But we also have to look at, like with baseball, Tony Clark is the guy in charge of the players. And to be fair, he's not doing a very good job. Fear is also, tutoring Matthew Schneider, who I felt like on the call really represented himself very well. Mm-hmm. And, he hasn't, he was always a level-headed guy as a player. I'd interviewed him a bunch of times, some of them longer interviews, and always found him to be like a good thinker, down-to-earth guy. That could be the guy taking over. So again, this is important that Fear is tutoring that guy who I'm sure he's taught him quite a few things about what to look for in the future and everything else. And then you have that guy in place. That's a good road to go down. So even past this CBA, it's a good road to go down.
Well, you talk about succession planning, right? And this is, you mentioned Tony Clark. Well, we talked a little bit about this, about Michael Weiner passing away, where Michael Weiner was a major component of the Major League Baseball negotiations. And if he had been alive, my opinion is a lot of this rhetoric and a lot of the argument and a lot of the stuff would not have happened, because he was a much more of a conciliatory type of person, was able to bridge the gap between the players and the owners, right? And we talked, succession planning. They ended up going with Tony Clark, who's a bit more antagonistic, a guy who played in the league, who has a different view. And that hasn't helped. Granted, Manfred hasn't helped. But in this case, right, Fear being able to tutor Schneider, who in this case, because he was a player and understands what the players want, but also has the down-to-earth mentality of what hockey players seem to have, would seem to lend itself well to him taking over potentially down the road from Fear when Fear decides to step down from the role he's in.
Now, a couple of the particulars that I thought were interesting that we discussed off the post on the weekend that I think we should talk about today. One, Carol Schramm, who writes for Hockey Buzz, brought up the 10% salary rollback. And how it's going to be paid in installments, basically over the length of the deal. But the question she asked to Bettman and Fear was whether that represented a 10% discount for the salaries against the cap, and they said no. So really, what we talked about Flyant's buyout in terms of a Larry Bird exemption, in terms of something that would relieve cap situations. None of that is in place. And with the flat cap and that being the where the game is, this is going to be really a tough scramble for a number of teams, including Tampa Bay and Toronto, to get to 81.5 or to be able to add players and stay under the cap.
So I had proposed two things. So one thing you said about is I thought the 10% should have come off it and it impacted the cap itself. The other piece is because of the slight increase. One thing I thought is with the add backs, you could have counted a cumulative against the cap moving forward because you're paying back the salaries anyway as a way to potentially increase the cap. But as you said, they've gone neither direction right now. So guys getting – first of all, we're likely going to see, as distasteful as it might be, the expectation is we're going to see some buyouts on some teams because they're going to have no choice in order to be able to get under the $81.5 million cap or you're going to have to deal players to try to create some additional room to sign some of your own free agents. The other piece is we've talked about a couple of times is are you going to see a decline in terms of the AAVs for some of the players in terms of the free agency because they're not going to be able to afford to give those big monster contracts for some of these guys. If somebody maybe was going to be an $8 million guy, does he now become a $7 million player because you just don't have the cap room anymore to fit him in under $8 million because you got to sign other players with no rise in the cap?
No, you know what? I think they're going to take shorter term. I think when I heard Fear say that the revenues, if they go up and they hit like a 4.8 million, then there might be a change in the cap because they made over 5 last year, 5.09. So there is a hope that, hey, it's not going to happen this calendar year, but maybe the year after, if things are back to normal and they come up with other ways of generating revenue, that may get better. So you might see some players taking that same AAV they normally would get and just take fewer years in hopes that it bounces back and then they get back in the market.
I think that what may happen here is that, and building in on what Russ was about to say, what Russ just said, I think the shorter term is the far more likely scenario because again, it gives you the opportunity. AAV-wise, the star players are not going to want to see a drop. You know, if a player comes up in terms of their contract, that's not going to happen. Where you may see a little bit of an AAV drop is going to be the bottom 6 type of players in that circumstance. I think that one you might see either they maintain, don't see it really much of a raise. Again, I hate to say it again, it's more of the rank and file employees that are going to be getting the short end in these circumstances more than anything. But the star players, I don't think. Now, whether or not collectively, Jan, we see like an overall average of AAV go down a little bit, that's possible. But I think the term situation I think is a bit more likely in this case.
We do have breaking news if you want to hear it.
Go ahead.
Bill Meltzer did post, and I had a feeling this would happen, but I didn't want to post it because I didn't want to jump the gun. You know, the Flyers put out their roster. Nolan Patrick is not on the roster, and that's
I mentioned. I tweeted that a little bit earlier. I actually tweeted that earlier, just before I jumped on the show. Prospect Yegor Zamula is on the roster.
Yeah,
is on the phase 2 roster. The young defenseman from Calgary, obviously physically recovered from his back surgery. So he is in camp, but Nolan Patrick is not on roster, and that's obviously not surprising, but it is certainly noteworthy in this case.
It's noteworthy.
But just going back to what we were talking about, the thing that Chris Johnston talked about this on the Dangle podcast yesterday, that essentially what is going to happen is, you know, they're anticipating that, you know, the rest of this year and next year, with the uncertainty of whether fans are going to be in the stands for part of the year or whatever, that they're not going to hit 4.8 billion, that they're going to be well below that. And essentially the owners are fronting the money to the players, you know, where they're keeping the cap at 81.5. They're going at the with the 20% escrow as the cap. And then as revenues climb back, the first thing that will be done is to pay back the owners for fronting that money. So what that means is the cap's not going up. The cap may go up $1 million in year 3, but more than likely it's not going up much more than that for probably the balance of the CBA. And if that's the case, then, you know, I think teams are going to be very hesitant about term and about AAV. We get an echo here. Okay. So I'm not sure who's echoing here. Let me mute people here just to see.
Check if it's.
Okay, it's not Anthony. No,
Okay.
no, it is Anthony.
It is. I'll log off.
Off and log back on. And you're yeah, there you go. So, I mean, I think this is the new normal, Russ. I think that this is, teams are going to have to, the reality is it's going to be 81-5 for a while. And Kyle Dubas had a press conference yesterday, and people asked him about, adjusting to the new normal and about, whether the best chance for the Leafs to win is this year before all this hits. And he basically said, well, we've got our core locked up. So we have enough money to sign our restricted free agents, and we'll see about our UFAs. He pretty much downplayed it, but I think he's sharp enough to realize that he's probably going to have to move at least a guy like an Andreas Janssen or a Kasperi Kapanen or a Nylander to be able to open up space to sign players down the line, because simply they have no room.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be quite a few teams that really only sign middling players. You and I were talking offline. It's not like the Flyers. Even if they move Gostisbehere, they can't make any big offseason transactions. And there's going to be other teams like that. But I do think like a guy like Alex Pietrangelo, see, I pronounced that right, Mike, so John Shannon doesn't get on me. He'll get his contract. But if you're someone like Mike Hoffman, he may only have to take a 2-year deal and then hope the market comes back. And I do think that's going to be a strategy, and I do think it's going to be a reality. Unless you're really, like Taylor Hall, somebody like that, you are going to fall in that other range where you're not going to, get signed right away. There's going to be a very big delay on. It's going to be like baseball, where a couple of years ago, when all of a sudden guys were sitting out there for a very long time. I think we're going to see not the superstars. The superstars will get signed fairly quick, but I do think the other guys, stars and lesser players, they're going to be sitting out there for a long time.
Jan?
I just think, so if you think about it, right? So Hoffman, right? We talked about the Jeff Skinner contract, right? So Hoffman was probably looking potentially to get somewhere in the $7 to $8 million range. To me, the likelihood of that happening is remote, right? You look at what Skinner got, right? In today's market, even if he was coming off that kind of a season, you're looking at a significant haircut off of what he may have wanted. And that's what I was pointing out before in terms of if a guy was going to be, let's say, an $8 million or a $7 million guy, I would lop $1 million off that salary, because of the fact that you now need to figure in other guys, and the expected rise where they thought we'd be at the 85 million mark now you're $3.5 million below that at a minimum for now, and you need to leave yourself some room. So that's kind of where I think is going to happen in terms of guys with salaries. I think the super duper stars, that the elite of the elite, as you said, are still going to get paid, but those guys who are tier below that are the ones, and besides the middle class, are the ones, in my opinion, are going to get impacted more than anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, there's fewer teams that you could dump guys to now. I mean, a lot of teams are in bad cap shape. There are very few that are in good cap shape. And so there's going to be teams that just can't do anything in the offseason. And I was just saying, like, the Flyers can't do a lot. They could sign a lot of 700,000 guys, but even if they move Gostisbehere, if they're lucky enough to be able to do that, they're still going to have to pay other players. They're not making any big transactions this summer. There's going to be a lot of teams.
But I don't think they are necessarily, if you look at kind of how they're constituted, I don't think there's really kind of a need. There's a burning need, I think, right now for a big splash acquisition right now. I mean, it does very much depend on who they, what happens obviously here in the Stanley Cup playoffs. Right. But if they're looking to make that sort of, a shakeup move, the team's on a pretty decent ascent right now. Top 4 in the East. You kind of probably want to utilize your depth, the forward depth and system. You look defensively, you're going to look probably your two guys. You're going to be probably losing, or you may lose Justin Braun. Braun's a veteran defenseman, but again, what he gets in the open market will be interesting to see. I think he had a solid rebound season from his last one in San Jose. I think they would probably like to have him back. They still have Niskanen under contract for another year. He and Provorov were a good partnership together. So I don't know if there's necessarily a burning need right now for Philadelphia to have to
backup goalie. If Brian Elliott has a lot of suitors because teams are looking to just get an inexpensive goalie, the Flyers could be in trouble in that spot.
They could. They very well. And again, they're going to lose. And they have Alex Lyon is coming off contract. But again. That's a situation that they would have to take a look at. I think they would probably have to be fairly aggressive early on with Elliott to see if he is, again, amenable to coming back. He did. I think they know Hart is still young, and you still, when it comes to goaltenders, need to have a decent distribution of starts.
Well, yeah. I think
in Philadelphia, he's got a decent chance of that because you want your main guy to be fresh going forward.
I think you're going to see a lot of 700 and 750 league minimum contracts with veterans taking 1-year deals to, because that's going to be the reality. But what I also see here is like contracts. It's like we talked about Rasmus Dahlin in Buffalo, Russ. I think there's no way. Even though Buffalo's got a ton of cap space with their financial situation, I don't know whether they're ready to pony up the 8-year deal on him, whether they just go with the 2-year bridge, like they would possibly go the 2-year bridge with Sam Reinhart.
I think it's different with Dahlin, though, only because I think they have to pay him because
I agree.
The thing is, even though they may be in financial whatever, if they don't pay him, he is only going to cost them more down the line, and there's no guarantee they're going to be making more money down the line. Plus, if they ever get to the point where they want to sell the Sabres and his contract's not locked up, that does keep some buyers away because he's a premium defenseman, and all of a sudden he could walk away and take another deal because you signed him to a bridge deal.
Well, this is what the problem is with the league right now. If you look at the list, and I'm just going off the top of my head in terms of like 5 teams that have tons of cap space. Say Detroit, Ottawa, Montreal, Buffalo, and New Jersey. Of those 5 teams, I think the only one that's prepared to actually spend the money and add players with the cap space available is Montreal because they're a well-to-do franchise. Ottawa has their financial problems. Detroit's in a rebuild. New Jersey is inherently cheap. And the Pagulas in Buffalo are in financial trouble as well. At least that's what they're reflecting with what they've done over the last few months. So those teams have cap space, but not necessarily do they want to add salary. So, okay, we talked about we heard about the Brock Besser thing from Rick Dollawall over the weekend. Okay, that's a great player. He's making less than $6 million. He could score you 30, 35 goals, but there has to be somebody out there that is willing to give up something of value for him and be able to afford him on the cap. And some of these teams can't do it or won't do it.
Or it has to be a team that has a level of surplus defensively. I think that's something that Vancouver could definitely use, at least a little bit more defensive depth there. That could be if you could get contracts that relatively come close on matching there, then that may be a way to that might be a path to make that kind of a trade. But again, if you're getting rid of Besser partly because of potential future salary issues,
right?
You got to be careful.
Hughes and Pedersen, you're going to have to sign, right? You're going to have to create room.
That's
for
what that's all about.
But if you think that it right, Besser was one of those core guys that we thought of, along with Bo Horvat, that looked to be one. And granted, obviously, you have Mark Jamal, so now you need to re-sign. So, same thing with the Rangers, right? You have Ryan Strome, who thought people were going to bring him back. They're going to have to make a key decision because also what do they do with Anthony DeAngelo in terms of whether or not they ended up signing him long-term or end up moving him based upon what his salary expectations are going to be. So we're going to have to now see that debate of player versus salary and where do you kind of draw the line versus, how far can you go before you start to bleed into other areas of your team where you have to make other moves even if you want to bring a guy back.
But this is the case where where you look at Brian Benning, and it's almost a reverse, as I mentioned over the weekend. This is almost a reverse, not quite, almost like a West Coast version of the Maple Leafs and how how cap distribution's handled. But in many ways, it's worse. As Patrick Johnson from the Province brought up to me over the weekend, the problem with the Canucks is that a lot of cap dollars is invested on the back part of the lower part of their roster. So they're potentially looking at shedding guys that are good players because of the amount of money that was spent by Benning on players that just aren't contributing but are high cap hits.
And the thing is, in looking at the Canucks, they already have one buyout on their books, Ryan Spooner from that Sam Gagner deal. They got 2 guys who I think would be good candidates for buyouts. One is Brandon Sutter, who's been hurt off and on. The other one is the disgusting contract of Louis Eriksson. And Eriksson's deal was front-loaded. But even if you buy him out, the cap hit is 2/3 of the remaining amount of money, which is $4 million. So that's what, about 2.75, something like that, spread out over 4 years. So that's $1 million cap hit instead of a $6 million cap hit for the next 2 years. So they could save a lot of money there, or Brandon Sutter, it would be spread over 2 years. All those things. But if they're considering trading Besser on top of that, then you have to figure it's Markstrom, it's Quinn Hughes when his deal is up after, I think, next year, and it's Pettersson. They have major players that they have to re-sign, and they just don't have the room.
They don't have the room today. They'll
be able to make the room, maybe.
Yeah, they'll be able to make the room. They'll do some things. I mean, it's just right now, if they lose Besser because of that, they're not going to be the only team in town. But that's where, like I said, a team like Montreal should be paying attention and trying to cut some deals, because they can swallow up salary and they could use more scoring, and that's a great situation for them to be in. So you might be able to see a draft day trade maneuver towards, like, a Besser to Montreal, because they have all those picks too. Right. That's kind of something that we could see. We didn't see any day one deals last year, but now that the cap is flat, we might see some day one deals this year.
I think we're going to see a lot of day one deals from teams that are looking to have to move salary, especially guys who are RFAs, that they're concerned that they're not going to be able to re-sign, but other teams may have some of the cap flexibility to do it. But we'll see what happens. I mean, look, I talked about Strome, right? D'Angelo's a guy who's been mentioned, partly because of the Rangers' depth, but partly because his play last year. He's going to get a massive spike in terms of what his contract was. He's probably going to be looking in the $5 to $6 million range, which may be tough for the Rangers to be able to afford, given other guys that they need to sign, unless they find a way that either Lundqvist retires or they move him or they buy him out, which is a feasibility.
See, I don't think they'll buy Lundqvist out. I think if they had to, they would buy out Stahl, who's the next biggest contract, and work that. But I do think there's a chance Lundqvist would retire. I do. Others are not so sure, but I do think there's a chance. So if that doesn't happen, then I think you're looking at Stahl. Brendan Smith, it's unfortunate. They should have bought him out last year, because now this year he gets a bonus and his cap hit's not that big.
Which they paid already, though, right?
No, but his cap hit's not that big as a result. That's the problem.
Right. His salary is now $2.3 million, which is why Ottawa's been mentioned so much, right? Because there's a substantive difference between his actual salary versus his cap hit, right? It's
no, but you move him
4.3.
Right, but even if you move him, you still haven't created enough room for the other guys.
Probably not. No, which is why we talked so much about amnesty buyouts and compliance buyouts and using dead cap space, none of which is part of the current deal. And the flat cap puts a lot of these teams in a bind in terms of figuring out what direction they're going to go in and who they can move.
But I think you're going to see more regular buyouts because they simply have to do it.
I do think that too, and I do think some guys, like as an example, I don't think Ryan Strome's going to have really much on the market. If he's smart, he re-signs with the Rangers, because his agent should realize the Panarin effect is what got him there. And if he goes on the market, that's what other teams are going to be saying. D'Angelo will get like 3 years. I don't think they're going to give him more than that, but they'll give him a high AAV.
Well, that's the point, right? So so you think about, Strome is an RFA with arbitration rights, right? Same as D'Angelo, which D'Angelo did not have last year. Lemieux has arb rights this year as well. Strome, they could try to opt for a 1 or 2 year deal, but because of his salary and the expected rise, you're probably looking at an AAV in the $4 million at a minimum range, which I have to take another look in terms of what the breakout point is. But as if it's below a certain threshold, even if he is awarded it, they can't walk away, right? So that's the other piece of the puzzle, where they may get quote unquote stuck with him, so they may try to move him after signing him to that AAV if it's too large based upon who else they have to sign.
Yeah, if you could sign him to an amenable AAV, then it makes him more tradable too, because now it's a known salary. That is a help too, and I do think some teams will try and do that with guys, because yes, then that does make them more tradable.
A couple of things from the conference call on Saturday that I thought were curious. One was when it was brought up, and this was brought even more to the forefront on the weekend, when in the MLS, a game between Toronto and I think it was Washington,
DC United, yes,
DC United, was canceled because there were positives on both teams, and the teams didn't feel comfortable playing. And I guess they're going to play that game either today. I think they're going to play it today. But Bettman was asked whether, what would be done if a team had rampant positives. and they would not allow a team to continue in the Stanley Cup playoffs. And he simply answered it with a non-answer of, well, we'll take advice from experts.
Right.
So I'm sure that they have a thought process here in terms of, are they going to shut down the whole thing because one team is infected? Well, they might, because the one team infected would be in a hub city hotel, and there's probably no way of determining unless you're continuing to test.
Well, they'll continue to test. So I think what they would do first is maybe cancel that team's next game, see where they're at. They're going to test all them first, and they're going to test everybody else in that hub city. Remember, it's only half of the league. It's not the full league because they're in the other hub city. So I don't think that cancels the league. But yeah, we could get to a point where a team has to drop out. Like, that's not impossible.
Right, and then the team that they were playing against would basically
move on.
Yeah, get a bye to the next round. Now, the other thing, we talked about this on Saturday, was the injury disclosure factor, where now Arpon Basu reported on the weekend that multiple Montreal Canadiens players had tested positive for COVID. We know that we obviously heard the Austin Matthews report from a few weeks ago. Everything apparently is going to be funneled through the league in terms of, they won't even say positive cases for COVID, or at least they won't describe which teams the positive cases were. And it's gone to the point, as Anthony, to start with you, it's gone to the point where if a guy has a concussion, that's going to be announced through the league. So everything is going to be funneled through the league.
Yeah, and as I stated, this is going to be handled in many ways just like it's like a large-scale version of the Stanley Cup Finals, where most injury reports are going to be coming in through the league, which, again, makes sense when you're playing at two centralized hubs. The league wants to have as much, control over what is said and what is done in terms of announcing these things. One of the reasons why I kind of joked over the weekend, it's the phrase will be general body infirmity or something like that when you get reports. And we saw, I think, Darren Dreger actually quote what those reports would likely come out as, and it wasn't that far away from it. So yeah, we're in it's going to be a really interesting to kind of finding out what injury reports are going to be, especially if you're laying wagers and things of that sort, which again is going to be a factor on this as well. On this, as much as I'm not a betting person, but I think that is going to be something that's going to be of concern to sports books and things of that sort.
I mean, I just figured from a health and safety perspective, right? You are having reporters that are going to be with some of the teams, yes. And even though technically you're in a bubble, you're not necessarily fully locked down in a bubble. So, reporting that players have come down with it is just as important to people outside of the team itself, right? You have other ancillary people that there are people who work for the team, people in the social media, other people there. You would expect that you would want to make sure that people are aware of what's going on and not just quote unquote use the nomenclature that we've come to expect from the NHL or the inability to report some of this.
No, but they are behind the scenes. They are and Gary Bettman did talk about how players will have to give a list of people they came in contact that happened to, and they're going to have to call them and do all the contact tracing. So that is going to occur. It's just that we'll never know what it is.
Right. We'll just guess based upon a player not being there for a certain period of time, and then
he doesn't care.
That, oh, wait, he's got COVID.
He was broached that, and he does not care if you guess or not. Like, it's just it just
seems ridiculous. It's it's just whatever. Just on the face of it, guys, this is not something that nobody else is going through, right? This is a pandemic. Admitting the fact that somebody is sick because of it doesn't seem like you're stretching the imagination here. I
think they feel like they're probably, if a reporter is willing to stick their neck out on this, a la Steve Simmons with Austin Matthews, that's the reporter's decision, and then the reporter has to deal with the blowback. The league does not want to have to deal with that. And whether it's HIPAA, whatever you want to quote from in the circumstance in terms of what medical information gets out, that's how the league is going to handle it. And it is a concern, but I'm not surprised. It's not surprising they're taking that tack.
You're going to have situations where players are going to disappear off rosters with little or no explanation.
Right, but I think
that's the reality.
Again, yeah. I think that's going to happen anyhow. Like with Max Domi not being in camp right now, right. He's technically an opt-out. But remember, Mike and I talked about this offline. With a Capo Caco, if all of a sudden the Rangers doctors think he's too much at risk, they may ask him to just go home. and say, hey, you know what? This isn't a good situation for you. And we could see some players drop off as a result. Just because they opted out doesn't mean they won't just go home because their health is too much at risk. That's probably going to happen too.
Yeah. Which is why I thought it's interesting that Luke Kunin, who's got type 1 diabetes, is in camp right away, while Domi, they're opting for caution to 7 to 10 days, which is what I thought should have been maybe what they did with Kako, with the same type of thing, to let's see how it plays out before he's there. But he seems like he's on the list immediately and he's been skating in camp.
Well, I think the difference is because we already know that Montreal had 3 to 6 players with positives. There's no reason for Domi to go in. I think that makes it more of a hotbed than these other teams we're talking about.
Yeah, and I was being humorous when I said this is an unofficial tank, but it's like, when you first of all, Montreal has little chance of beating Pittsburgh. Now you've got 3 to 6 players who probably if they've tested positive, they're not going to be available. So essentially, it's going to be Laval playing against the Pittsburgh Penguins. You know, if you're Max Domi, do you really want to risk your life? Because on a series like that, when you're coming up for a new contract, there are a number of factors. The health concerns obviously are at the forefront. If I'm him, I'm like, okay, this team has no chance to win anyway, so why the hell should I play?
Plus, also interesting, how did they get it? When did they get it? Where did they get it? Are they asymptomatic? If they are asymptomatic, then they'll be back quicker. If they are, then the likelihood is they may miss, depending on the time frame to heal. And to get into playing shape, they may miss a good part of that first round. So all those are factors in terms of the potential end result that we think Pittsburgh's going to win anyway. But as you mentioned, this clearly could even tilt the scales even more towards Pittsburgh winning in that round.
Right, but the other thing is, and that could happen, but Carey Price could shut them down too. I mean, that's not impossible. It's just not likely. The other thing is about saying a guy has COVID is, remember, this a lot of times shows up as a blood disorder. They're finding out more and more that it affects your blood cells. It may be hard for them to actually pinpoint it in a player and say it's X or it's Y. And so that's another reason maybe not to say it, because it may not actually be accurate.
Yeah, and this was an interesting quote Emily Kaplan had from Bill Guerin that I thought was, I'm not saying that some of these players aren't taking things seriously, but when Guerin comes out and he said his message to the team was stay home as much as you can, try to stay out of the bars, just be smart, not just for us, but for the league. We want this to get off the ground. If you're out at bars at this point, I mean,
listen, Guerin was a player. He knows this is very smart for him to call that out and say it specifically. That was smart.
And considering the positives that the St. Louis Blues had, where a lot of that had been traced to an unofficial gathering at a bar,
right?
It's right there. I mean, at least you've seen it. The evidence is there. If you go do this, the risk that's involved.
This is why I like Bill Guerin, because he doesn't wait for things to happen. He tries to get ahead of it, and he knows, hey, if I was a player and I was 20 years old, there's a chance that I still might do that. So now I'm going to put the hammer down now. So at least that may keep these guys in line.
Now, a couple quick things before we end the show. One, there have been 6 opt-outs so far. We have the deadline at 5 p.m. on Monday, not including Domi, because that's still up in the air. I think it's 7 to 10 days before he's going to make a decision. Right. But nobody of major consequence, except for maybe Travis Hamonic for Calgary. And most of these are third line, fourth line players, or seventh defensemen like Roman Polak or Steven Kampfer. So nobody of any, there have been some major players in the NBA, some major players in baseball, and so far there have not been any major players in hockey. But we'll see by 5 p.m. But I don't think we're gonna. I don't think we're gonna see it. I don't think we're gonna see a major player drop out of this.
I mean, so far we haven't. It doesn't mean we won't last minute.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm not holding out hope on that just yet.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll see. And the other thing is the interesting notes about the Russian players that we've talked about ad nauseum, Alexander Romanov, Kirill Kaprizov, and Ilya Sorokin. Romanov, they've gone so far as to give him Carl Alzner's number. So he is signing a 3-year deal. They're burning the first year. He's not eligible to play, but he's going to accompany the team to Toronto. Kaprizov is going to accompany Minnesota to Edmonton. even though he's not eligible to play. So I guess this is sort of like, ingratiating him and getting him used to the NHL lifestyle, even though this is a complete departure from what the NHL lifestyle is going to be.
Yeah, and I got word late last night that things are going well with Sorokin, and the agent seems very positive, so we could see something with that soon. And so, yeah, I guess adding that extra phase 3 and 4 was a good kicker to get these guys to come here and at least be a part of the team, even though they can't play.
And burning that year 1 of ELC right now also is nice and palatable to them because it gets them to that next contract a year quicker.
Yeah.
All right. We will probably have some interesting notes from some of the openings of training camp tomorrow. We'll probably
the big question. Hold on, you can't sign off yet. The big question is: will you be wearing something gray in the hospital for good luck?
For Jan Levine, for Anthony Mention, for Russ Cohen, I'm Michael Agello. Thank you for watching, and remember, without the buzz,